Ukraine and the United States could have taken a very clever step in the negotiations to end Russia's war against Ukraine, amid all the noise surrounding the peace plan developed by the United States and Russia. The visit of President Zelensky and his national security advisor Umerov to Turkey went completely unnoticed. Many media outlets reported that Ukraine did not participate in the creation of Donald Trump's peace plan, but that doesn't seem to be entirely true. Many people said that Trump's representative, Steve Witkoff, was supposed to meet with Zelensky in Ankara, but cancelled the meeting at the last moment. Since Zelensky refused to even discuss the United States-Russia peace plan and instead brought to the talks in Turkey a peace plan that was developed together with the Europeans. But it turned out that Recep Tayyip Erdogan, with whom Zelensky was communicating, also took part in developing the peace plan he was talking about. In addition, the first very telling inconsistencies have appeared. Today, Zelensky is meeting with American generals who have arrived in Kyiv. Many media outlets are reporting that these generals are persuading Zelensky to agree to capitulation according to Trump's plan. But looking at the biographies of the American generals, their track records, their involvement in preparing Ukraine militarily, and their stated goals, it's more about clarifying what weapons Kyiv needs. It's very hard for me to believe that these particular generals came to Kyiv to betray Ukraine, but if they wanted to do that, they would have sent, for example, Hekset or his assistants. Moreover, sources are already reporting that peace talks are not the main goal of the visit. That's why there's definitely something to discuss here, both in terms of foreign policy and the internal events happening in Kyiv today. I'm Alexei Pichi, let's discuss this topic in detail. But before we start this episode, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pichi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we post breaking news as it comes in. If you want to support the work of this channel, you can do so with any donation or paid subscription using the links and details in the description of this video. I would be grateful for any support from you. So, the administration of United States President Donald Trump has prepared a draft peace agreement on Ukraine, which is now being actively discussed with Europe and representatives of Moscow. According to Western media, the draft peace plan involves handing over territory in eastern Ukraine to Russia. First of all, those parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions that are currently under Kyiv's control. So, in Donald Trump's version of the peace plan, these zones were supposed to be demilitarized, formally under Russian control, but without the deployment of Russian troops there. How this will look is still unclear. The peace plan also provides that Russia would supposedly pay rent for control over Donbass. According to this scenario, Ukraine would not formally change its own borders or recognize the occupation, but would allow Moscow to control this territory for a fee. Besides the territory, the plan also provides for a large-scale reduction of the Ukrainian army, specifically cutting its size down to 40% of its current level. A ban on foreign military missions and restrictions on weapons systems, especially the long-range strike capabilities Ukraine uses to hit targets in Russia's rear. Well, as you can understand, Russia, of course, is not going to reduce anything on its side and has no intention of cutting any missiles. The document also mentions the winding down of American military aid and a ban on the deployment of Western troops on Ukrainian territory after the end of the war. Moscow, in response, declares its readiness to provide guarantees that it will not resort to new attacks either on Ukraine or on other European countries, and it even promises to formalize this pledge at the legislative level. But let me remind you that earlier, many media outlets reported that Ukraine did not participate in the development and discussion of the peace plan that the White House is now promoting. But that may only be partly true. Let me remind you that the day before, on November 19, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, visited Turkey where he met with Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This needs to be noted. In addition, the special representative of the United States President Steve Witkoff planned to meet with Volodymyr Zelensky in Turkey on Wednesday to discuss the new peace plan. However, the meeting did not take place because the president of Ukraine allegedly arrived with a different plan, which was developed by Ukraine and Europe. Apparently, in the White House, they were almost offended that Zelensky didn't want to discuss their peace plan. That's why Trump backed Witkoff, who reconsidered meeting with Zelensky. There you have it. A Ukrainian official told Axios that the meeting was postponed because Zelensky asked to discuss this plan in a broader format that would include European countries. Zelensky asks why meet Vitkov alone, suggesting instead to meet all the Europeans. An American-Ukrainian official said Ukraine's domestic political scandal involving corruption and opposition to Zelensky's circle was another reason for delaying the meeting. But here it can't be said that Zelensky's team didn't know about this plan in advance at all. They knew at least 3 days before it started being discussed publicly, maybe even more. Moreover, there are hints that parts of the plan were actually discussed with the Ukrainian side in advance. Let me remind you, on November 11, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Rostem Umerov, urgently went on a foreign business trip. First, he visited Turkey, then the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. Later, on November 16, Umerov flew to the United States of America, where in Miami he probably met with Steve Vitkov, with whom this peace plan was discussed on November 16. And already on November 19, Rustam Umerov met Zelensky in Turkey with that very peace plan. That is, Umerov at least knew about the peace plan in advance and knew what was written in it. But that's not all. The geography of Umerov's movements is very important here. Axios reports that Qatar and Turkey are participating in the development of a new United States peace plan to end the war in Ukraine and are supporting United States mediation efforts. They say that the mediation of Qatar and Turkey helped end the war in the Gaza Strip and could help end the war in Ukraine. And now attention! Axios sources say a top Qatari official joined talks in the United States last weekend between Trump's envoy Steve Vitkov and Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council Secretary Rustam Umerov. This confirms the meeting occurred and the peace plan was discussed. As part of Turkey's support for Trump's peace initiative, Steve Vitkov planned to visit Ankara on Wednesday and hold a trilateral meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan. However, in the end, the meeting did not take place because the Ukrainian president was allegedly not interested in discussing the new American peace proposal. But this is also a strange statement, since Erdogan knows everything that is happening, and Zelensky actually held talks with him. Once again, Turkey and Qatar are involved in developing this peace plan, and Zelensky meets with Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And one more important point. Today, a high-level Pentagon delegation arrived in Kyiv. It's important to note that recently, Ukraine and the United States have been working on a major deal involving drones and autonomous munitions technologies. According to Politico, this visit is part of efforts to accelerate this process. Now let's talk about who actually came. Daniel Driscoll, the United States Secretary of the Army, served in the Army from 2007 to 2011 as a cavalry reconnaissance platoon commander in the 10th Mountain Division. In 2009, he was deployed to Iraq, where he served for 9 months. Driscoll, a college friend of jurist Dr. Wantz, studied with him at Yale Law School. Let's continue. Randy George is the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, a 4-star general appointed to the position back in September 2023, that is, during Joe Biden's administration. He has been in service since 1981 and took part in the Gulf War. What is very important is that Driscoll and George cited Ukrainian innovations on the battlefield as an example that the Pentagon should follow. Here is a quote from Driscoll. Let's take Ukraine. When certain types of weapons don't suit them, they just modify whatever they need to get the desired result. And here is a quote from Randy George. What we've learned from the Ukrainians is how quickly they learn. And we've tried to replicate that rapid technology adoption and learning. And the third delegate is Chris Donahue. That last name is definitely familiar to Ukrainians. He also commands the United States Army in Europe and Africa. A 4-star general who oversaw cooperation with Ukraine in the first months of the Russian invasion, Donahue was responsible for providing Ukraine with intelligence, managing arms supplies, and training Ukrainian troops. Donahue, by the way, once established a very close connection with Mikhail Zabrodsky, who was the general's deputy in 2023-2024. And now it is known that Driscoll, George, and Donahue will meet with top Ukrainian military officials and military industrial representatives. They will discuss the situation on the battlefield and weapons production, in addition to ideas on how to stop the war. And now it is reported that after his visit to Kyiv, Driscoll is allegedly planning to meet with Russian officials, although today Peskov and Zakharova denied such plans. But the most paradoxical thing is the Wall Street Journal's report that Steve Witkoff helped Driscoll prepare for the negotiations in Kyiv. They have known each other since Trump's presidential campaign, and this is where the inconsistency appears. Looking at these people's biographies, their track records, and how long they've been connected with Ukraine, it's hard to imagine that these generals came to urge Zelensky to surrender. But let's be honest. If Washington wanted to completely abandon Ukraine, they would have sent Pete Hegseth or his assistant Elbridge Colby, who together have already stopped aid to Ukraine several times this spring. It's not difficult for them, so for now, the puzzle of a total betrayal of Ukraine doesn't add up. But as they say, we'll see. I'll put an ellipsis here. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to leave a like. That's all for now. Take care. Bye, everyone.